In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it.
In his inaugural address, Lincoln had promised not to make the first move against the South, but he had also pledged to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government. After his inauguration, the country entered an anxious period, as both sides waited to see what the other would do. In the spring of 1861, Lincoln faced a problem no other United States president had ever faced. Secession had split the country in two, and the South was in open rebellion. Should he make war on his own countrymen, or should he continue to try to find a peaceful solution? The most pressing situation was at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, where the Union garrison was surrounded by Confederate forces.
Fort Sumter was the most important and prominent federal installation still in the hands of the federal government in the seceding states, in the 7 states that had gone out by the end of January 1861. Fort Sumter was also in the harbor of Charleston, which was the hotbed of secession. South Carolina was the most fire-eating pro-secession state. And so Fort Sumter had taken on enormous symbolic importance to both sides.
On Lincoln's first day in office, he had received notice from the garrison commander, Major Robert Anderson, that they were running short on supplies. Anderson estimated that he could hold the fort for a little over a month longer before he and his men would be starved out. While the country cried out for action, Lincoln carefully considered his options.
Lincoln basically had 3 choices of what he could do about Fort Sumter. He could pull out the 90 or so American soldiers and yield to the commissioners from the Confederate States who were demanding that it be turned over to them. That probably would have preserved the peace, but it would also have given an enormous boost to the Confederacy's assertion that it was a sovereign, independent nation. And Lincoln, who was, of course, insisting that secession was unconstitutional and illegal, and that the United States still was supremely sovereign over all of those states, would have been yielding that whole point that he had come into office pledging to maintain.
Lincoln was under a great deal of pressure from all sides. His own advisors were divided over the question of Fort Sumter.
One choice was to send reinforcements, armed naval ships carrying troops to shoot their way into Charleston Harbor and reinforce the fort. But to do that would place the onus of firing the first shot, of starting a war, on the side of the federal government. The North was already divided over what ought to be done, and this would divide it further and would probably unite all of the southern states, not just the 7 that had seceded so far, against the federal government.
At last, Lincoln made up his mind.
An attempt will be made to supply Fort Sumter with provisions only. If such attempt be not resisted, no effort to throw in men, arms, or ammunition will be made.
So Lincoln chose a third course, and I think it was a stroke of genius. In effect, Lincoln said to Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, "I'm going to flip a coin. Heads I win, tails you lose. If you fire on the supply ships or on Fort Sumter, then you will have started the war. If you let the supplies go in peacefully, then you have yielded an important point of principle. That is, you have yielded the idea that we are continuing to be sovereign over this state and the American flag will continue to fly."
Jefferson Davis called an emergency meeting of his cabinet to consider a response to Lincoln's move, but on the subject of Fort Sumter, his cabinet was no more unanimous than Lincoln's.
The firing on that fort will inaugurate a civil war greater than any the world has yet seen. You will wantonly strike a hornet's nest, which extends from mountains to ocean. Legions, now quiet, will swarm out and sting us to death. It is unnecessary. It puts us in the wrong. It is fatal.
The bombardment of Fort Sumter began at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861. There were only 80-some American soldiers in Fort Sumter. Not all of them were skilled artillerists. The fort was built to house 600 men to handle all of the guns. So the Unionists at Fort Sumter, the American soldiers, could only fire a few of the guns in response, and they were limited in ammunition. Major Anderson really had to surrender after 33 hours of bombardment because the fort had been set on fire in several places. That fire threatened to get to the powder magazine, which would have blown up everybody in the fort if it reached it. His men were exhausted, and so to save his men, to save the fort, he decided that he must surrender.
On April 14, 1861, the American flag was lowered and the Confederate flag was raised over Fort Sumter.
So civil war is inaugurated at last. God defend the right.
The day after Fort Sumter fell, Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to serve in the Army for 90 days. From the free states, the response was overwhelming.
The cars thronged with young men hurrying to the nearest enlistment place. The millionaires' sons rushed to the colors by the side of the laborers.
In the Confederate South, the patriotic spirit of the people was no less fervent.
Every person almost was eager for the war, and we were all afraid it would be over and we would not be in the fight.
While the onset of the war provoked a patriotic frenzy to preserve the Union in the North, it had the opposite effect in the states of the Upper South. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas immediately seceded and joined the Confederacy. The slaveholding border states of Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri hung precariously in the balance as their secessionist and unionist factions struggled for power.
The state of Maryland, in some ways, is the most important of all, because if Maryland had gone out, that would mean that the United States Capitol was surrounded by the territory of a foreign and enemy country. So it was essential to the Lincoln administration to hang on to Maryland. It was essential in Lincoln's mind to hang on to Kentucky. He said, I think if Kentucky goes, all is lost. Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland together had half of the industrial capacity of all of the 15 slave states. They had a fairly substantial portion of the white population of the slave states. If they had gone with the Confederacy, I think that would have made the Confederacy too large, too powerful, too viable a country for the rest of the United States ever to subdue.
At the beginning of the war, both the North and the South felt confident of victory. Each side believed its cause and its character to be superior to the other. Both Union and Confederate soldiers saw themselves following in the footsteps of their forefathers, carrying out the legacy of the American Revolution.
Most Confederate soldiers said they were fighting for their country, fighting to defend their states and their new nation, the Confederate States of America, from invasion by a hostile Yankee nation. So they felt that they were defending their homeland, their homes, their hearth, their country from foreign invasion.
Most Confederate soldiers did not claim to be fighting for slavery per se, but for their way of life and their independence.
We had better all go the same way than suffer the wretches who are trying to enslave us to accomplish their ends. I prefer death to Yankee rule.
In the beginning, few Yankee soldiers went to war with the desire to overthrow slavery. In fact, many had no desire to see the slaves freed at all.
If emancipation is to be the policy of this war, I do not care how quick the country goes to pot.
Northern soldiers fought for the preservation of one nation indivisible. They felt that if secession was permitted, that would mean the end of the United States. It would also mean the end of any kind of democratic political order. The United States was a fragile experiment in republicanism, in democratic government in the 19th century.
Because the North had greater material and manpower resources than the South, to Northerners it seemed obvious that the South would quickly be forced to surrender. Although the North had most of the material advantages, the South had certain strategic advantages.
The chief strategic advantage of the Confederacy was its huge size, 750,000 square miles, as large as France, Germany, and Spain altogether. To invade, conquer, and subdue such a huge territory would be a huge logistical and military task for the North. Another strategic advantage the Confederacy had was that it would be fighting on the defensive to defend territory that it already controlled politically and militarily. What did it have to do to win the war? It merely had to force the North to give up trying to invade, conquer, occupy, and subdue and destroy Southern armies.
The key factor on both sides is whether or not the civilian population will stay hitched to the war, in a sense. Whichever civilian population gave up first would doom that side's war effort. So the South didn't have to conquer the North, just persuade a majority of Northerners not to fight. The United States, theoretically anyway, didn't have to conquer all of the South, just persuade the Confederate people that the fight was no longer worth it.
In the spring of 1861, most people in both the North and the South believed the war would be quick and almost painless.
It was a common attitude on both sides among many people that there probably would be one large battle, and whoever won that battle would win the war. Others more familiar with what wars are like had no illusions that this would be a short war. They knew it would be a long war.
Woe to those who began this war if they were not in bitter earnest.
The Civil War would ultimately produce two legendary military commanders, General Ulysses S. Grant for the Union and General Robert E. Lee for the Confederacy. But when the war began, neither man had reached the height of his powers.
At the beginning of the war, Robert E. Lee was one of the most promising officers in the United States Army. He had just been recently promoted to colonel. He had a sterling record in the Mexican War. He had graduated second in his class at West Point and had entirely fulfilled that promise. And indeed, so prominent and so promising was Robert E. Lee that just before Virginia seceded, he was actually offered command of the largest Union field army. Grant, although he had a very good record in the Mexican War, had languished in the peacetime army, had resigned from the army as a captain in 1854 under a cloud, and had tried a number of civilian occupations without any great success. And at the beginning of the Civil War, he was an obscure salesman in his father's leather store in Galena, Illinois. To compare Grant and Lee, I think Lee was probably the preeminent tactical commander of the Civil War. Tactics means the handling of troops on the battlefield in the presence of an enemy. His sense of timing, his ability to detect the weakness in the enemy position and the psychological weakness of the enemy commander in many cases was almost uncanny. But Grant, I think, was the top strategic commander in the war. Strategy means the handling of armies over a large territory to bring them into a position favorably to engage the enemy. And Grant was superb at that.
Lee and Grant were very different men, but in each other, they met their match.
They did share one quality which made them stand out from most of their contemporaries. They were both willing to take risks. They were not afraid of failure. They recognized that in commanding an army in battle, one has to accept the possibility of failure in order to achieve success.
The first thing in the morning is drill, then drill again, then drill, a little more drill, then drill, lastly drill.
In the spring of 1861, Lincoln named Irwin McDowell to command the Union forces in the East, known as the Army of the Potomac. While McDowell organized and trained the thousands of soldiers encamped around Washington, D.C., the political pressure to attack the Confederates grew stronger. Finally, Lincoln could resist the pressure no longer. Although McDowell still believed his troops were too green for battle, Lincoln ordered him to attack the Confederates at Manassas Junction, 37 miles southwest of Washington, on a creek called Bull Run.
General McDowell and General Beauregard, the Union and Confederate commanders respectively at First Manassas or Bull Run, had the same plan. Each wanted to turn the other's left flank. McDowell began very successfully. He turned the Confederate left flank, and the initial stage of the First Battle of Bull Run was a grand Union success. The battle unraveled for the North when Confederates managed to stop the northern attacks, especially the brigade of Thomas Jonathan Jackson, who earned his nickname Stonewall on that battlefield, and then by the arrival of reinforcements late in the afternoon, which turned the tide and enabled the Confederates to not only blunt the Union assaults, but to drive the Federals from the field. Green troops, once things begin to go badly, often flee a field, and that happened to the Northern Army on the battlefield at First Bull Run. The soldiers began to first drift away from the battlefield, then move away very rapidly. There were also many civilians who'd come out from Washington to watch the battle, and these civilians got caught up in this retreat as well. So you had a quite amazing jumble of military men, animals, wagons, civilians caught up in this great movement back toward Washington. It took the Federal Army nearly 5 days to get to the battlefield at First Manassas and get ready to fight. It took them just a few hours to get back to Washington.
Bull Run was a severe blow to the morale of the North. Some even suggested that the war was a lost cause and the Union should make peace with the Confederacy. But for most, it inspired a deeper commitment. After Bull Run, the war effort was vastly expanded. War production increased, and new volunteers were enlisted for 3 years instead of 3 months. And Lincoln brought General George McClellan to Washington to assume command of the Army of the Potomac. But McClellan was not the general Lincoln hoped he would be.
He was afraid of failure. He had been born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He had gone through West Point, graduating at the age of 20. He had graduated second in his class. He had had a meteoric rise in the pre-war Army as a young officer. He had never failed at anything. And as a consequence, I think he was afraid to risk failure. And he thought of all kinds of excuses and reasons why he could not undertake an offensive, why he could not commit himself to a major initiative.
While McClellan paraded his soldiers in Washington, Union armies in the West took the offensive. In February of 1862, General Ulysses S. Grant captured Forts Henry and Donelson. Grant's victory forced the Confederates to retreat southward, abandoning Tennessee to the Union. Grant's next target was Corinth, an important rail junction in the northeast corner of Mississippi. Grant spread his troops out along the Tennessee River at Pittsburgh Landing, confident that the Confederates, under General Albert Sidney Johnston, would remain on the defensive. On Saturday, April 5th, General Grant was notified of signs of an impending attack. Disbelieving them, he sent a wire to his superiors.
I do not apprehend anything like an attack on our position.
The next morning, as Union soldiers were making their breakfast, the attack came. It began near a small church called Shiloh, whose name meant Place of Peace.
The first day at the Battle of Shiloh was an amazing exercise in contrast. The Confederates managed to surprise the Union Army. They drove back the Union defenders on many parts of the field. The Federals rallied in a place called the Hornets' Nest. One division of Union soldiers did, and beat off a number of Confederate attacks. Throughout the day, many of the Union soldiers fell back from the lines where the battle was being fought and cowered along the banks of the Tennessee River in the rear areas.
When the fighting ended on the first day, the Yankees had been driven 2 miles backward. One good push would drive them into the river.
Now, those Yankees were whipped, fairly whipped, and according to all the rules of war, they ought to have retreated, but they didn't.
Each side expected reinforcements to come. Confederate reinforcements did not arrive, but Don Carlos Buell and his army, his Union Army, did arrive to reinforce Grant's soldiers at Shiloh. And the second day was really the reverse of what had happened on the first day. This time the North was doing the attacking, driving back the Confederates little by little, until finally Beauregard, who remained in command, realizing he was not going to be reinforced, decided to abandon the field, which he did late in the day.
We have at last had our wish for a hard battle gratified. And never again do I expect to hear the same wish from the lips of our men.
Shiloh was an enormously important battle, really one of the watersheds of the war. In a strategic sense, it opened northern Mississippi, and Corinth especially, a key rail center to the advancing Union forces. It really sealed the fate of western Tennessee. But beyond that, it served as a wake-up call to people in both the North and the South that the war was going to be far costlier than they had thought it would be. More than 20,000 men fell at Shiloh on April 6th and 7th, 1862. That's more casualties, more Americans killed and wounded that had been shot in all other wars down to that point in our history.
Up to the Battle of Shiloh, I, as well as thousands of other citizens, believed that the rebellion against the government would collapse suddenly and soon if a decisive victory could be gained over any of its armies. But afterward, I gave up all idea of saving the Union except by complete conquest.
Despite the defeat at Shiloh, the year 1862 was the high-water mark for the Confederacy. In the East, although the Union troops significantly outnumbered the Confederates, General McClellan consistently overestimated the enemy's strength. General Lee brilliantly exploited his hesitation, proving that he was everything McClellan was not: bold, aggressive, and not afraid to take risks. With less than half as many men, Lee fought McClellan to a stalemate at Antietam on the bloodiest day of the entire war. And at Fredericksburg in December, General Ambrose Burnside led the Union soldiers into a one-sided slaughter at Marye's Heights. Rebel soldiers, protected by a stone wall, mowed down wave after wave of Yankees in what Burnside's own generals had warned him would be murder, not warfare. With superior resources on every count, the North was losing the war in the East. Beset by military defeat, political dissent, and grieving over the death of his middle son, Willie, Lincoln was deeply discouraged.
We are now on the brink of destruction. It appears to me that the Almighty is against us.
In October 1862, Matthew Brady opened a new photographic exhibit in New York. But these were not the vivid portraits of high society that he was known for. They were photographs of the dead from Antietam. Northerners who had been far removed from the actual carnage were shocked at the scenes they depicted. The photos only contributed to the feeling in the North that somehow the war had gone fearfully awry.
At the end of 1862, things looked very good for the Confederacy and very bad for the Union. But this was not something that had evolved in a linear fashion over the past year. Rather, I like to use the image of a seesaw. In the first 6 months or so, 5 months of 1862, the Union forces seemed to have everything pretty much their own way, especially in the Western theater. It looked like the Confederacy was just about finished. But then Lee and Jackson and some of the Western Confederate commanders launched counteroffensives in the summer of 1862 that drove McClellan's army out of Virginia. And Confederates who were down for the count of 9 in May 1862 had by September 1862 crossed the Potomac to invade Maryland and had invaded Kentucky and reached almost the Ohio River in the Western theater. So at the end of 1862, Union armies on several fronts were demoralized, frustrated. Confederates were confident, looking toward possible victory once the spring campaign season began in 1863. And most outside observers would have said at the end of 1862 that it looks like the Confederates were on the verge of winning the war.